Hi, can you hear me? Good.
Hi, can you hear me? Great, thanks.
Hi. Ooh. Hope you can hear me, because maybe I'm going to have to step in.
Okay, so just trying it now, and yes, they seem to be fine. Thank you.
It's working fine for me as well. Thank you. Back to you, Nicole.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Just being mindful of time, I think we will get started as people begin to join. We'll just wait for them. So hello, everybody. Hopefully you can hear me. My name is Nicole Cork. I am the Association Manager of iHEA's activities. Welcome, and thank you for registering for today's webinar, Successful Abstract Writing Tips for the iHEA Congress, which was made possible by a grant provided by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Today's webinar is being translated live from English to French and Spanish. So if you prefer to listen in another language, we encourage you to adjust your language at the bottom of the screen. You should see a drop down at the bottom that says your language, and that's where you can change it. The webinar is going to run for approximately 60 minutes, and we are recording it to upload on our website afterwards. If you do experience any technical issues during today's webinar, you can contact technical support by clicking on the question mark on the bottom left of the screen. There's a live support agent who will be able to assist you quickly. Everyone on the line has been muted except for the speakers, and you will not be able to unmute yourself. So please use the chat box for any questions or comments during the webinar. Questions will be addressed by both speakers at the end of the webinar. Finally, we will be sending a brief survey out following this webinar, and we do encourage everyone to complete this as it's important in terms of offering future multilingual webinars. I will now pass it over to iHEA President Winnie Yip, who is going to introduce today's speakers.
Thank you, Nicole. Well, welcome to this webinar, and this is actually the first of a series of webinars that we are introducing between now and next year in the broad area of capacity building. So this one is on how to write a successful abstract for Congress and other conferences. There will be others that will be along the line of how do you make a successful presentation, how do you write a grant, how do you write for different journals as well. So today we're very delighted and honored to have two presenters, Joe Coast and also Manoj Mohanan. Joe is professor in the economics of health and care at the University of Bristol, and she is, of course, the scientific chair for iHEA 2021 Congress. She has various research interests across healthcare decision-making, including capabilities, end of life, and qualitative methods. She currently holds a Wellcome Investigator Award and is also senior editor for the Health Economics Office of Social Science and Medicine. Manoj Mohanan is associate professor at the Stanford School of Public Policy at Duke University. He also holds secondary appointments in the Department of Economics and at Duke Global Health Institute. Manoj's research has examined questions related to quality of care, provider performance, delivery of services, and governance. His current work includes research on accountability, social networks, and COVID. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor to them. We welcome you to this session, and also I look forward to your questions and engaged discussion with the speakers as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Well, good afternoon if you're in the UK, and good other part of the day if you're somewhere else in the world. What we're going to talk about today is how to put together an abstract and just really give you some tips for the iHEA Congress for next year. So obviously we'd all hope to be in South Africa for this conference, and sadly that's not going to be possible. So iHEA will be going online, and we're quite excited about that. Although in many ways it's not the usual experience, it will enable a lot of people to participate who might not otherwise be able to. And so we hope that you'll also be engaged with the virtual Congress. We are aiming to make it as good as we possibly can, with really high quality scientific presentations and lots of opportunities for discussion with colleagues. So we would definitely encourage you to submit an abstract, and to that end, that's what the rest of this is all about, really. So I'm going to go take you through the process in a number of stages, and I think the first one that it's worth thinking about is whether or not you want to submit an individual abstract or an organised session. So an individual abstract is one that you would submit to be considered for inclusion in a contributed session, which is made up of a number of individual abstracts on similar topics. Or you could submit an individual abstract which would then be taken as an e-poster. So that will be a poster that's available on the conference platform with a brief recorded oral presentation. Or the other option is to submit an organised session. So that's a session of 3 to 4 presentations with 1 or more discussants attached to that session. So you need to make that decision first. I'm going to talk now about individual abstracts, and then I'll just say a little bit towards the end around organised sessions. So before you start writing, there's some things to think about in terms of individual abstracts. So, sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button to move forward. So it's important that it's something that you haven't previously presented or previously published. I think when you're thinking about what's the best thing to present, what you really want is something that isn't too early in the process or too late. So you don't want something that's so early that there's a danger that you won't have anything to say and you end up pulling the paper even if it's been accepted. But you don't want something that's too late in the process either, because if you get comments that suggest that something you've done is really fundamental, you don't want to have already submitted the paper for publication. So it's about thinking about the balance of when you want the right thing to submit at the right time. I think it's an international conference, so you want the paper to be of international interest, and you need it to be within scope for iHEA's conferences. So obviously it needs to be within the area of health economics, but that's a very broad field and it gives you a lot of space, a lot of scope. But every year we do get some abstracts submitted that are out of scope, so they're not really health or they're not really economics, or they might be one or the other but not both. So I think one of the things you can look at to see whether this is the right place to submit is the subfields that we have on the system. So make sure that your topic will fit to one or more of the subfields. And if not, then maybe it's not the right conference for you to submit your paper to. You need to make sure that your submission meets the basic checks that are going to be conducted. So the paper needs to be anonymised for blinded review. You need to stick to the word count, and you need to give the basic information that's requested on the online form. So that'll be things like conflict of interest or presentation information. And I would suggest that you choose your subfields carefully, because that will influence who gets to look at your abstract when the abstracts are being assessed. Something also to just make you aware of this time is that we've got a couple of other things that you need to think about beforehand. So one of the questions that will now be asked when you submit your abstract is about fair opportunities for presentation. So it's important that you think about fairness in terms of who's presenting research on behalf of your team, and should it actually be you who's presenting it, or should it be, for example, a doctoral student working on the project or another member of the team. And as I say, there will be some questions on the abstract form to try and make sure that the chosen presenter is a fair chosen presenter. There'll also be ethics approval question on the form to complete this time as well. So before you start writing in terms of organised sessions, there's a couple of other things to think about. So one of them is to start early, because you're going to need to line up 3 or 4 presentations on your particular topic of your session. So you need to get those people sort of thought about and lined up early. I would suggest that if at all possible, go international. It gives different perspectives on an issue. And when you've got an international audience, having research in different contexts is interesting for the audience. I think if you go international, it's likely to increase the participation in the session. So you can do that in a couple of ways. You can use your existing contacts, or you could try and generate new contacts through iHEA as well. A couple of things to say because it's an online conference, or particularly one thing to say because it's an online conference, which is just think about time zones. because you don't necessarily want to have the second presenter in your session having to get up at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning to do their presentation. So you might want to think a little bit about that this time. Having said, about going international, it is also sometimes okay to break the rules. So if you've got a major programme of work and something that already people are interested in, then you could perhaps do 3 or 4 presentations on different aspects of that work, and that might be interesting to the review committee, but I think it is a bit of a more risky approach, so I will be careful about going down that route. So that's all the sort of preliminary thinking. Now let's move on to think about actually putting together the individual abstracts. So I think I've lost some of my headings on these slides. So when I first started research, my first boss talked to me a lot about papers and researchers and how to put together a paper. And one of his things that he said was every paper needs a peg to hang it on. So you need to be really careful about what your paper is about. Be clear what your abstract's about, what the research question is that you're addressing. So make sure that your paper has a phrase somewhere that says something like, this research aims to, or the hypothesis tested in this research is whatever, because if you're not clear, then the reviewer won't be clear either about what your paper is about. So every paper needs a peg to hang it on. And then the second thing that he used to say was 1 paper, 1 point. So that's really about thinking about not having 10 different things in the paper that you're trying to talk about. Think carefully about the key point that you're making, what the contribution of your research is, and then that key point should run through the whole abstract, from introducing the problem to researching it to providing your answer to that problem. So I would say be very careful not to let your key contribution get lost amongst a whole load of supporting information that you're putting into the abstract. Make sure you stay focused on what it is that you're trying to talk about. So titles are the first thing that the reviewer sees on the submission system and even before they open the abstract. So make sure that the titles are relevant to the iHEA Congress. And they need to be relevant and it needs to be clear what the presentation is going to be about. So I would try to make it engaging, try to make it not too technical and something that will catch the reviewer's interest. So poor titles might be something like Health in China, which could be about absolutely anything, or something like Profile Case Best Worst Scaling using scale-adjusted latent class analyses with a 2-scale preference class solution. It might not be clear what the paper's about, it sounds very jargonistic, so not ideal as a title. So a stronger title might be something like, why is health expenditure rising in China? An investigation of the role of the new healthcare system. That's something that's clearly related to health. It's clear that there's a research question. The research question sounds potentially interesting, and everybody can read that and understand what it might be about. So as we go through the rest of the ideas around putting together an abstract, I'm going to use an example abstract that I put together for a congress a couple of years ago, and that has the title Using Economic Outcome Measures for Assessing Benefit in a Hospice Setting, Feasibility, Appropriateness and Adaptation. I do hope everybody can see the slides because I'm missing all the titles and the very bottom of the slides as well. So we'll make do as we are, but I might have to just give you bits of extra information, particularly over the next few slides. So as we go into the abstract, the first thing to think about is the background or the introduction. So things to do here, start with the issue. So what is the key concern that's driving you to conduct this research? Then you need to describe the current state of affairs, think about the research gap that's you're trying to fill with your research, and then I would end with the aim of the research that you're going to present. So what I'm going to do now is just give you an example from that abstract that we'd put together, and hopefully if we can see the whole of the screen, I'll be able to show you the different bits as we put them together. So yes, we're missing a little bit. We're missing the top 2 lines, so you might not be able to see all of it. So in this abstract, this was the introductory section that we had. So the first part, which you can't read, but I will read it for you, is the issue. So it started off by saying, measuring the quality of end of life with generic health instruments has been criticised by palliative care researchers. So that was really the issue that we were trying to address. Then we went on to talk about the current state of affairs. So this was talking about the fact that the measure that had been developed was available and what that measure was, but that it hadn't yet been tested in an end-of-life setting. Then we went on to look at what the research gap was, which was around how this measure could be used, how it should be used. And then we had a section on the objectives of the measure, which really talked about what the aim of the research is that we were going to present. So that really focused on feasibility of completing the measure in particular groups of people. So then, moving on to think about the methods. So really important to be as clear and precise about what you've done in the research as you possibly can. And I think that's particularly important in a conference abstract, because often in a conference abstract it's not that possible to give a huge number of details about the results that you found. So really important in terms of convincing the reviewer about the strength of your study to have a good section on the methods. So I would say start with your study design and then give some very specific details around things like sampling, who the research participants were, the setting, where the study took place, how you collected your data and how you analysed your data. And I'll do the same thing again, going through the methods for the abstract that we put together. Right, hang on a moment, I can't tell what. Sorry about this. Okay, so yes. So in that abstract, the very top part talked about the study design, and that basically said the study used the Think Aloud design alongside semi-structured interviews. And I have to confess that actually the original abstract didn't have this in. I added it in as an illustration. So even when we know how we're supposed to present these things, we don't always get it exactly right. But anyway, so I've added that in because it should have been there, so that you can see what it looks like. Then the next thing was we talked about the setting. So patients receiving palliative care were identified and recruited through an urban hospice. Then we talked about the sampling, so the fact that people came from different parts of the hospice. Sorry. Okay, so I'm getting a bit on the chat that says that other people can see the slides, it's just me who can't see them, so I'll assume you can all see them. Okay, thank you for people letting me know that. The sampling was around patients and the close persons and the health professionals who were identified, and then the abstract went on to talk about data collection. So the groups were asked to complete the questionnaires, and that the interviews were recorded. And then the final part of this bit was that the data were analysed using a technique called constant comparison. So that gives you an idea about how to sort of set out and make sure that the words that you've got available are really being used to give information that the reviewer is going to be looking for. Okay, going on to think about the results. So, like I said, often it's the most difficult part of a conference abstract submission because of the timing. What you can talk about in the abstract is often less than you'll be able to talk about when you get to the paper. So my advice is to really give as much information as you can. And I know Manoj is going to talk about this more in relation to quantitative abstracts, where you might have slightly different things that are available to you. But I would say give as much information as you can. So if you finish your data collection but not yet your analysis, then present things like the number of participants, basic socio-demographic information, your preliminary findings. If you've collected some data but not all of your data, then you can give information about how many people have been collected to date, maybe something like the end date of your data collection and any preliminary analysis. So just to go on to illustrate the results from the abstract that we put together. So we started off by giving some details of the sampling by the point at which we put in the abstract. So at that point we got 56 interviews. By the time we actually did the conference, we'd finished our data collection and the final numbers were in the 70s. And then the rest of that section we used to give some preliminary results, which is perhaps easier with qualitative work because a lot often you do your analysis in quite an iterative way. And then thinking about the conclusion to your abstract. So what I would say is don't try to replicate the sort of discussion that you would have in a paper. So for example, I wouldn't talk about strengths and limitations. That obviously will come in the full presentation, but you don't have enough space to do justice to that. So I would really just focus on the key contribution that the presentation is going to provide. And the other thing that you might want to do, although I sometimes do this and don't always do this, is suggest topics for discussion that will be helpful in the conference. So just to illustrate that, here we talked about the fact that the measure provides a feasible measure for use in assessing benefits, but that adaptation amongst patients might be important. So we were just trying to give the main message from the research. And I think at this point I'm going to hand over to Manoj. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and it's wonderful to join you. As Winnie mentioned, my name is Manoj Mohanan, and I will be helping you think about how to write a conference abstract. But the great part about coming immediately after Jo's presentation is that much of the hard stuff she's already covered. So I'm not going to try and repeat that. Instead, I'm going to try and help you think about how to write abstracts that are slightly different from the one that she just showed you, but focusing a little bit on two types of quantitative types of abstracts and research projects. I'll also leave you with a little bit of sort of parting thoughts on thinking about sort of big picture issues about being precise and how do you write. And hopefully that will be helpful and we can take questions later as well. Since this is going to a health economics conference, I think it's useful to first think about what your objective function and your budget constraint is going to look like. Right? The objective function for us as writers, as authors of these abstracts, is we want to get the reviewer excited to hear more about the paper. Only if the reviewer is excited is our paper going to get accepted to the iHEA conference, and our main budget constraint is going to be space. If we did not have a space constraint, we could have just submitted the paper and that would be fine. However, we have a space constraint, and so it's that constraint that's going to help us think about how to convince reviewers that our paper should be included on this program. And as all of you know, the iHEA conference is competitive, so a lot of conference abstracts that are very good still do not make the cut. So just let me start with helping us think about how long is a 500-word abstract. Despite having written many abstracts, some successfully, some unsuccessfully, I often tend to forget how long is actually 500 words. So this is in an 11 size font, and you can see it's not very much space. The amount of space we have to convince the reviewer that what we are proposing is an interesting idea and meets all the checkboxes that Jo just led us through is not easy to do. It's going to be tight no matter what. So let's try and be precise about what we can include and what we cannot, especially because in a large number of the quantitative types of analyses, you will have 10, 15 tables. And the challenge always is going to be what do you include in the abstract and what do you leave out for the rest of the paper. So first, let's go back to the first topic that Joe mentioned, which is picking a topic. For most cases, most of us will be picking topics that are coming from research projects that we are already working on. It's going to be really tight if you start with a new topic right now, and you will have enough progress made that you can present it by summer of next year, right? So if you think about it, right, the results are expected if you want to start a new project and get there. Maybe with secondary data analysis you could do that, but if you're actually working in the field, chances of getting there are very slim. But on the other hand, if you're working on an ongoing project where results are expected by around March, April, and you are submitting the abstracts for iHEA by around November, December, it's possible that you can make a promise, or you have a plan that you can analyze that data that comes in by March, April, and be able to say something in the conference. So how you write an abstract with that constraint is very different. Because just going back, the reason why this is important is just going back to that earlier point that Joe made. That is, you don't want to present something that's too early and something that's too late. If it's too early, which means you've not yet started field work or collecting the data or have a plan for when the data is coming in, it's too early to present, because chances are you will not have the data in hand by the time you will get to the conference. On the other hand, for some of these empirical, large quantitative projects, defining what's too late is a little challenging, because the publication period is so long that even if you've submitted it to the first journal, it might be a couple of years before it's actually accepted for publication. As a result, even if you know that you have one final draft of your project that you're ready to submit, that might not necessarily mean that that's going to be the final published version. And in fact, presenting it a lot will give you lots of feedback that might help improve the paper. So I'll show you an example. One of the abstracts I'll show you fits into that category, where it was ready for submission, but then the subsequent published version deviates quite a bit thanks to conferences and presentations, which give us this kind of feedback. Okay, so the parts of the abstract, you've already seen all of this. I'll just highlight a few details that are different. One is when you're looking at an empirical piece, which is about, you're running a quantitative analysis, you will want to try and focus a bit on the motivation to convince the reader in that tight space why the question is so important. You, of course, have to specify the question or the hypothesis, as Joe pointed out. You might want to say something about the uniqueness, about why this question, if it's so important, why have others not been able to do this? In other words, you're going to say something about your study design or solution that makes this approach credible. Because if it was that easy, that obvious, then clearly others should have done it too. So if you are clearly doing something different or novel, then this is your chance to try and explain that to them. You also need to say something about the analytical methods that you're going to use and a key finding. And I want to underscore what Joe just mentioned earlier. You might have 25 tables in the paper, but you want to focus on the one key finding that the reviewer needs to know. And of course, a comment about a broad policy implication. So you can say something about how important my finding is. Great. So do you need a finished project to write this? Again, I said this earlier, but again, the point here is not necessarily, but if you do not have a research project, which means you do not have a finding, then you will need to convince the reviewer that the project will be done and you will have conclusions that will be credible by then. And in order to do that, you will have to give specific information on the state of the data collection, the state of the analysis plans. If you have some preliminary results that say, for example, Joe gave us the example of how the data was coming in, how many interviews were conducted. That's a great example of specific information on data collection. But you want to be careful not to go too much into too many details, because you don't want to lose the reader. Great. So I'll give you a couple of examples of abstracts and hand it back to Joe after that. Ideally, I should show you something that's a good abstract, a bad abstract, and an ugly abstract. The sad part is all the bad and ugly abstracts I could find were my own, and so I don't want to embarrass myself too much. So I will show you a good abstract and a passable abstract. A very good abstract that we'll look over is one that Adeline Delavand, Niaz Asadullah, Sonia Palhotra, and Zaki Wahad had submitted to a previous iHEA conference. And it's a very good example of analysis of survey data that they planned to do. They had access to the data, they had an analysis plan, but there were no results at the time of submission. And then what I would call a passable one. It has its flaws. This is a work abstract that my co-authors and I had submitted again to the iHEA in 2017. It's analysis of experimental data. So it comes from a randomized experiment, but it has the way the abstract was done. I wish now, in hindsight, it was done better, and I'll show you both of those. Great. So this is Adeline's abstract that I referenced earlier. It talks about parental investment in young children and subjective expectations. So you know what the topic is. You do not know what the question is quite yet. But what's nice is the first thing that the authors do here is they tell you why this question is important, what they're going to study, why this is important. It's about the various potential explanations for the correlation between maternal education and child health. And understanding which one of these explanations is actually more salient is really important for research and policy. So then they tell us that they're going to investigate this relationship, whether more educated mothers have better knowledge about the returns to investments in children. But they're going to do that using exogenous variation, right? So they tell us, if you read through the abstract, which I do urge you to go back and read when you have more time, is they give you all these different channels that could just be correlation. And so in order to get over the correlation, you need to do something. And that something is coming from these exogenous variations in education. And so then once we know that, okay, it's an important question, they're trying to do something different by solving this correlation problem using exogenous variation, how do they do it? So here they tell us about how they're going to do it, is they're going to ask parents about beliefs in survey research. Once they have information about the parents' beliefs, and a lot of psychology research tells us that some of these beliefs could be or character individual, whether they are stable or not, using that information on beliefs and preferences, then they can go back and analyze this information. So then they tell us about the specific methods are about analyzing newly collected data. So notice they don't have any results to tell us at this point, but they tell us a lot about how they will work with this data. They're going to use the survey research to evaluate whether mothers are aware of the returns on investments. They are going to use the exogenous variation. And then they will assess how the actual investments are driven by women's expectations. And so all of this is to convince the reader that although they do not have any results yet, this is what they plan to do. And then finally in the discussion, they tell us how they'll make sense of it all, which is they're going to use the results to shed lights on the mechanism for what has been observed in the literature, this systematic correlation between mothers' education and children. So this is a good example because at the time when they submitted it, they did not have results. They had the survey going on. Ideally now, at this point, it would have been good for the authors to also say something about the state of the survey, or how many observations there are and what the size of the data set is, which is one of the weaknesses of this abstract. But it checks off most of the other boxes so far. One other point to note, it's very hard to write the perfect abstract. Even Jo, when she went back and looked at her own abstract, she found things that she could have done it better, right? So we don't need to necessarily make it perfect. We need to make it good enough that our reviewers are happy with it. Great. So now let me turn and tell you about the not so great abstract. This is work that I did on input-based contracts versus output-based contracts in health. So it was a cluster randomized experiment. And in our introduction, we tell them about what is the central question. The central question here is that you can reward providers with two types of contracts, but there's very little evidence on this. And so in order to provide rigorous empirical evidence on whether these supply-side incentives actually lead to improvements depending on the types of contracts, we did an experiment. So it's, one of the nice things about experimental research is it's sometimes easier to craft your question because you have to do that anyway during your grant proposal writing stage. However, I think what's useful for us to note here is the good and the bad about what we did in this abstract. So the methods part was, again, straightforward because it's an experiment. So we describe very briefly what the treatment arms look like and what the experimental intervention is. And then we say something about why this is unique. This is where, with hindsight, I might have wanted to revise this. I might not have wanted to say something about we are the first to do something. It's very nice to claim all of that, but oftentimes it also reflects possibility that there might be other stuff that we have not yet paid attention to. And sometimes the reviewer is the one who might have been working on the exact same project or subject. And by saying that I'm the first to do it, you might actually offend some reviewers. So it's best to avoid language like what we did here. The second thing I think is a limitation of these types of projects where you have an experiment is often you have to register your designs before you go ahead and do your analysis, a pre-analysis plan. This is great, but what we do here is in some sense a cop-out, where we just said that we are going to be using this analysis design that we've already published elsewhere, so go look at it. So effectively, I have now created more work for the reviewer who has to go click on this, find the study design, and understand the analysis. Frankly, if I had to rewrite this again, this is not what we should be doing. We should be at least giving a key idea about here's the main analysis plan, or here's the main analysis I plan to do, and this is what we will be doing, rather than this cop-out strategy, which I'm frankly a little embarrassed about. But this is one way you could improve even an experimental paper in this case. And then finally, there's a little bit of key findings that we add in there. And what I won't go through the details. The key findings here help the reviewer understand that analysis has been done. This is what we find, that there are large effects, 13 to 14% improvements, and so on and so forth. What you will notice here is I've left a link to the paper, the current version of the paper. It's forthcoming in the AJ Applied. But you will notice that the paper has changed significantly over time. And this is because between the time when we presented it first at iHEA in 2017 until now, the paper underwent significant changes. And it's because of feedback that we got from conferences like iHEA. So overall, in terms of writing abstracts such as these, let me say two things. One is, especially as researchers coming from developing countries, I grew up in India, and the way I learned to write was very different from this kind of writing. So learning to be precise and deliberate did not come easy, and it needed a lot of iteration. So the first thing I would say is never, ever, ever submit your first draft. Write it, edit it, proofread it, put it away for 2 days, or show it to your colleagues who are not on the project, ask them to read it and give you comments. Getting a fresh set of eyes to read your abstract and tell you whether it makes sense is a very good idea before you submit. And this generally goes to this idea that whether we like it or not, developing writing skills to be able to write decent abstracts is something one has to learn. It just doesn't come naturally. So for some of the more health-specific journals, there is a more formulaic way of writing it. But then for fields like health econ, which is a sort of at the interface between health and econ, you will have to do a little more than that. So let me stop there and hand back to Jo. I'm sure she has more to add on this as well.
Thanks, Manoj. I have to say I completely agree about the need for editing and re-editing whenever you're doing this sort of writing. It's really important to get views and also to put it away yourself and come back to it, because you often see things, mistakes or things you could have done better when you come back to the next version. What I want to do just before we finish and move towards questions is say a couple of things about putting together an organised session, and then just go on to think about the process of submitting and what happens to your abstract after it's been submitted, because I think all of us want to know sort of what happens to it once we submit it. So in terms of putting together organised sessions, many of the things are very similar, so much of the process is the same. So every session also needs a peg to hang it on. It needs something that the session is about. And I would say also that the thing about one session, one point also works, albeit that the point that you're making at a session level is at a higher level than the individual abstract. So you could see each abstract as being a sort of sub-part of the overall point that you're trying to make. What you need to know is that each abstract as well that you submit as part of the organised session needs to fulfil all the requirements of the individual abstract, but you will also need to add an overview for the session as a whole. And if you're the person who's organising the session, it's really important that you know that you will have to submit the entire session. So you're going to need all the relevant information for all of the abstracts in the in the session before you're able to submit it. Just to say a little bit about the overview section that you need to write for your organised session. So you have about the same amount of space again as you have for the abstract to introduce your overall session. So you want to introduce the overall topic in a couple of paragraphs, just like we talked about the introduction for the individual abstracts, but then you need to introduce each paper individually and say how it contributes to the overall aim of the session. And one thing to say this time, which is different from previous congresses, is that the organised sessions will be subject to blinded review this time, and so that means that in that writing that overview, you mustn't say the paper by X and the paper by Y. You're going to have to refer to them by the first paper in the session, the second paper in the session, and so on. You also need to explain a little bit about how the discussion is going to be facilitated, and also indicate the overall session contribution. So it's a bit like the end of your abstract is the end of your overall session contribution. It needs to say how your session is going to contribute to the conference and to the literature. So just moving on to think about the actual process of submission. So make sure that you do some final checks before you submit. So make sure that everybody who's an author on your abstract is happy with the abstract and agrees to submission. So don't submit abstracts without the agreement of all the people who you've named as an author. Exactly the same thing as Manoj was saying, get comments from other people, especially senior colleagues, and particularly if you don't have co-authors on your abstract, or more than one or two other co-authors. Most senior people are willing to give you a bit of help, and I would absolutely say proofread before your abstract before you submit it. So once you have submitted, what happens to your abstract? Well, it's going to be assigned to 3 reviewers. And all of those reviewers will have expertise in the subfields that you select. So when you submit your abstract, you'll be asked to select a certain number of subfields, and the reviewers who look at your abstract will have expertise in those areas. Each reviewer will score your abstract, so they'll score it from 1, which is basically something irrelevant to the conference, to 10, which means it's absolutely marvellous, and we really want your abstract in the conference. They might make comments, but that's optional. And then what we'll do from that is produce a mean score, and then we do some checking of the scores to make sure that we don't have individual reviewers who are what are sometimes referred to as hawks or doves. So hawks are reviewers who score everything really harshly, and doves are people who are really kind to everybody. And we need to just make sure that that's not going to be a problem when we combine all the different reviews for the next stage. So then what happens is that the information on the review scores goes to the programme leads, and those programme leads are all people who've been selected based on their expertise in the particular field, and then the decisions come to me and Anna as the conference chairs. And what happens is that the programme leads will make initial recommendations on acceptance based on the scores that they've got, but also their own, looking at the papers to some extent as well. And both they and the overall conference chairs will be checking to make sure that submissions haven't been disadvantaged by outlying scores. And then eventually we'll finalise across the different programmes. And what we're doing there really is just making sure that we haven't got very different thresholds for acceptance across the different programmes. And that's obviously important in terms of fairness for people working in different sort of sub-areas. The decision will be sent to you sometime, usually around March. Di might know if we've got a specific date yet. I'm not entirely sure if we have. And then what might happen? Well, you might be rejected. And I would say if that happens, don't be too downhearted. It happens to everybody to get rejected. it's not quite as useful a rejection as with a rejection with a paper, because you're not going to get any comments with the rejection. But I think it's important to think honestly about why it might not have been successful, and also to think about how to take the work forward. So is it that it should go to a different conference, or should you move it straight towards publication? But as I say, don't be too downhearted. If it's accepted, obviously celebrate, and then make sure that you've got the things in place to attend. So make sure that you've got the funding for the conference, that you've got agreement from your line managers and so on, and make sure that you respond in a timely manner to the sorts of things that come out to you from the conference. And that's particularly going to be the case this year, because I think we are likely to have at least some presentations that are pre-recorded and available in advance to give time for live time for discussion, and that means we really do need people to be responsive as things come to them. So good luck with your abstract submission, and I'll hand back now to Winnie so that we can take questions.
Well, thank you very much, both Joe and Manoj. So Joe, why don't you stay on for a little bit? Someone asked you to elaborate a little bit more what you mean by going international with different perspectives. If you can just provide a bit more elaboration and maybe an example or so.
Okay, so I think what I was meaning there, I was talking about organised sessions particularly. So I was thinking there that it's important to try and bring different papers, so that you're not just coming at, say, for me it would be probably a UK perspective on a topic, and if you have an international perspective, if you have an author or a piece of research from another area, then it can be more useful in terms of enhancing the debate and not making it too parochial. I suppose generally within an abstract, I would also try to make, I suppose this comes partly from editing papers as well, but I think it is useful if you can make your, even just your individual abstract look like it's of something that's of interest to more than one very small area. So one sort of thing you could think about is, if your work is, say, set in the UK, but it's about, say, end of life, which is just something that I know a bit more about, I might start the abstract by talking about end of life generally, and then use a couple of examples from different countries, and then go into my own particular piece of research in one setting. I think what you're trying to do is just make it clear that your paper is of more general interest than just the very specific setting that you're in. I think that's what I would say. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I would also add to what Joe just said that if you can put your question in the context of a broader interest rather than motivated with this is a question that one country or one particular area is interested, and therefore this is the analysis, of course, then that is would be as attractive to a larger audience than if you can actually say that this is addressing a larger question, but we're using this particular context as an situation to address that. That would be more attractive. There are a few questions for Manoj. One question is, how do you handle changes between the abstract submission and the program if it is actually accepted? Because sometimes in between the abstract and when the program, the Congress happens, there could be changes. That's question number one. The second question is that many of us are facing challenges of not being able to conduct field work or finish the field work. So some may be turning to using archive data. So you mentioned something about old, not being too old data. So how old is old? Or maybe some general advice for the audience on the possibility of using archive data. Thanks, Manoj.
Thank you, Vinny. So let me start with the changes questions. That's a slightly easier one to take on. In general, I would say just first thing, as soon as you know that your plan has to be changed, reach out to the program chair, and and speak with the program chair, and she or he might tell you whether or not a modification to your plan will still fit in within the session that she or he is organizing. If it turns out that that's not possible, you might have to either then just withdraw your paper from the conference or see if there's another session that it fits into. But in general, trying to make these last minute changes about reorganizing the program is extremely difficult. So I would urge not to push on that because it will make lives of our colleagues like Joe's miserable. So let's not do that. But if you do find any changes, I think it's really important to let the chair know early on. So just to give you an example, the conference abstract that I showed you from Adeline and Sonia and others, that had undergone a similar change. And I was chairing that session, and so they wrote to me early on when they found that the results were just not panning out, wasn't making sense, and so they had to change the analysis and were looking at a different aspect. However, it was still within the broad topic that we were covering, which was around subjective expectations and health. So it was possible to still fit the paper in, even though the original proposed session was going to be slightly different on that particular paper. If it changes dramatically, then I think that's obvious. Then we might have to withdraw. In terms of the data question, I think actually it's a really good change that we are seeing where now, because of COVID, we are forced to go back to using a lot of the existing data sets. Frankly, my own personal view is a lot of us, and I'm to blame equally on this, is we have not used existing sources of data as much because the sort of allure of new data is so appealing that we are always chasing new data sets and new experiments and new studies. While there's a ton of resources on existing data sources that we have not exploited fully. So I would first say the push towards using, or the need to use, existing sources of data is quite welcome actually. In terms of thinking about how old, I would characterize it in the following way. If you are looking at the impact of a specific program or a specific policy innovation that was done in the 1960s, then that research project will be salient or interesting only if that particular program or some variant of it still exists. If it was done once and all you can say is this particular nutrition supplementation program accomplished this in 1970s, it's a historical fact. It might not be that appealing. But because this is a health economics conference, I would hope that we are doing something deeper than that. That is, look at the underlying economic mechanism or the behavior, which should be more time invariant. So within that nutritional supplementation program, if you're able to use the data from the 1960s to say something novel about investments in children, parental behavior, or health-seeking mechanisms, provider incentives, these are things that should not change that dramatically over time if it's behavioral. And in that sense, then using archival data is totally fine. So you might want to make that decision based on what the question is, and I would always urge you to use a behavioral lens to look at those questions rather than just effect of program X. Over.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Manoj. And to Manoj's point, I would also add that whether the data is old or not, it depends very much on the question that you're trying to address. So this goes back to both of their points. What exactly is the question that you're trying to address? And I would say that for some questions that have been examined for a number of times, but there is one last remaining gap, that tend to have a bigger demand on data. But there are sometimes a question that is quite big, quite new, and there hasn't been much out there. So quite often the value of a piece of work is judged compared to what is already known. And when you look at the data, whether it is old archive data or whether it is new data, you should ask yourself this question: does this data help me produce new knowledge to the question. I think that's an important test. So I have another question, a long question. So let me just read that carefully. And then I'll decide who should go to. If I have a previously submitted abstract, submitted paper to one of the health economics journal, but was rejected for some reason, it is a paper on health economics. Can I still follow the advice given here to submit an abstract to the same conference, hoping that I would get more feedback from the conference is accepted for presentation? So maybe I can answer this. So this is a question of if you already have submitted your paper, it's already rejected, can you still submit it to a conference? I would say that, when we review abstract, we don't really care whether your paper has been rejected, because sometimes when you submit a paper and if it has been rejected, the reviewer may have given you very constructive and useful comments and to revise, so you can still consider submitting it to the conference. However, if the reviewer's comment is to say that this is really an old question and the data and the design that you have doesn't really allow you to provide any more contribution, that put it in a slightly category, because when you submit it, the reviewer for the abstract would most likely arrive at the same conclusion as well. So again, ask yourself, am I submitting something that have a good, clear question, and is what I'm doing going to be new, right? Both Manoj and Joe have highlighted. How do I convince my reviewer that I'm going to be contributing to the literature, what is new? So depends on what your reviewer's comment was for you in terms of reason for rejection. So I think we have, there's one more question, which is how do you address citation of other authors? Joe, would you like to take it?
Hi, yes. I would not usually put citations in a conference abstract, certainly not one for a health economics conference. So I would, when I'm writing the introductory section, I would usually just talk about previous research, as said, but I wouldn't cite the previous research. I guess the key difference, the key time when you might want to cite something, but again, I probably wouldn't give it as a citation. I would just talk about authors, particular authors. If you really want to address a hypothesis that some authors have put up, then I might say X and Y say blah blah blah, but I wouldn't usually put personally I wouldn't usually put a citation in the abstract, mainly because you're trying to work with only 500 words, and if you're going to have, especially some of the medical journals, which are great long titles and great long lists of authors, then that's going to count toward your 500 word limit. So I wouldn't usually include citations in an abstract. Thanks.
Great. Just in case you're looking at a question, maybe this, I'm just trying to guess what is the motivation of this question. Maybe this is also respond to, I can't remember what is Joe or Manoj saying that maybe some other people have done that work. You want to acknowledge that. I think it is okay for you to say so-and-so et al. Which year, but without putting the full citation in, so that the reviewer would know and also be aware that, yes, you are under limit of words, but also know that you're aware that something is already out there. I noticed that this is already time, and I don't see more questions in the chat box. So let me turn it back to, but thank you. I just wanted to thank both Manoj and Joe. These are really helpful hints. not just for new researcher. I would say that if we post it out there, there's probably a number of other mature researchers will still value these guidance. And also thank you for the participants. So let me turn it back to Nicole.
Thank you so much to Winnie and to Manoj and to Joe for that presentation. So it will be uploaded on our website afterwards. And I know some people asked for the slides, so we will try to make those available as well for everybody to see. It should be up in the next day or so keep an eye out for that. And we will be sending out a survey as well. So hopefully everyone will be able to fill that out. And if you do have any follow-up questions, you can always send them to us via email if they weren't addressed today. Thank you so much to everybody and have a wonderful day.